In this video, we'll learn one of the nuances of Aristotle's view of pleasure by looking at two different vices that look very much the same until we delve into them. Those two vices are intemperance and incontinence. Now, we've already talked about intemperance as a vice in relationship to excessive pleasure. Incontinence is another vice in relation to excessive pleasure, and continence is another virtue in relation to it. So we'll need to see what the differences and similarities are for these two vices. Both intemperance and incontinence have to do with excessive pleasure. Both of them involve the pursuit of a life of pleasure that gets in the way of other pursuits. And both the incontinent and the intemperate person indulge in pleasure excessively. Their behavior looks very much the same. But Aristotle still wants to distinguish those two states of character. Here, he gives a definition of incontinence. The person who is prone to be overcome by pleasures is incontinent. Now, we might think that both the incontinent person and the intemperate person are prone to be overcome by pleasures, but that turns out on closer examination not to be the case. It's only the incontinent person who is overcome by pleasure. The intemperate person has a different problem. Aristotle says here on page 130, it is not surprising if someone is overcome by strong and excessive pleasures or pains. Indeed, this is pardonable, that is forgivable, provided that he struggles against them. In other words, because of the fact that human beings are built, as Mill also thinks, to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain, it's not surprising if we find someone whose level of tolerance for pleasure or pain is at a specific level, will vary in terms of those. But because human beings have a tendency to be overcome by strong and excessive pleasures and pains, we shouldn't be surprised if we find someone who gives in to their human nature in that way. But further down, it is surprising if someone is overcome by what most people can resist and is incapable of withstanding it. So again, Aristotle wants to say that each of us is going to have certain limits with regard to resisting pleasure or pain tolerance. And it's perfectly human for us to give in to those tolerances at some point if the pain or pleasure is especially strong or excessive. But we want to have a look at those times where we're overcome by relatively weak pleasures or relatively weak pains that most people are capable of dealing with. And that's the case for both the incontinent and the intemperate person, although more so for the incontinent person. So we'll look first at Aristotle's distinction between continence and incontinence, where continence is the virtue and incontinence is the vice. It actually will help, despite the way that I've arranged the slide, if we begin with incontinence and then go back to continence. So at the bottom of the slide, the incontinent person knows that excessive pleasure is bad. By the way, that's the first clue to the difference between incontinence and intemperance. So the incontinent person knows that excessive pleasure is bad, but the third bullet point there, the incontinent person is someone who tends to act out of feeling and not out of reason. So they abandon rational calculation. So the incontinent person knows that pleasure is bad, but they're strongly drawn toward pleasure from the perspective of feeling. And then the middle bullet point, the incontinent person abandons rational calculation. In other words, incontinence involves knowing what's wrong, feeling like doing what's wrong, even so, and giving in to feeling while abandoning reason. So the influence of reason in the life of the incontinent person is too weak for them to withstand the call of pleasure. So let's look at the contrasting case of the virtuous person who has a continent relationship with pleasure. The continent person also knows that excessive pleasure is bad. So this is not the difference between the continent and the incontinent person. Both of them know that excessive pleasure is bad. We'll have to look somewhere else for the difference. But the continent person, again to the third bullet point, I got this slide all mixed up. The continent person does not indulge in excessive pleasure, right? So the continent person and the incontinent person are different in their behavior. We watch them and they behave differently, even though they have the same opinion about pleasure. They have the same judgment about excessive pleasure. So then what's the difference? Second bullet point at the top, the continent person follows reason rather than their feeling of being drawn to excessive pleasure. So the continent person's behavior is in harmony with her reason and in disharmony with her feeling, whereas the incontinent person has a conflict between his feeling and his reason, and feeling wins. Okay, so in the case of the continent person, reason is stronger than feeling, and in the case of the incontinent person, reason is relatively weak and feeling is able to get the upper hand. So here we have on page 118 the evidence in the text from what I just said, if you want to look at Aristotle's own words on that subject. So now Aristotle makes the distinction clear between incontinence and intemperance. Remember, the incontinent person behaves the same way as the intemperate person, but we're going to find out that their mental or spiritual states are different. The state of the soul is different. The causes of their behavior are different, even though the behavior is the same. So let's read this and I'll comment as we go along. Further, if someone who acts in pursuit of pleasant things, so both the incontinent and the intemperate person act in pursuit of pleasant things above all, because this is what he is persuaded and decides to do. Now that's different. That actually turns out to be the intemperate person. Remember, the incontinent person thinks that the pursuit of excessive pleasure is wrong, but does it anyway. The intemperate person believes that the pursuit of excessive pleasure is right? So for the intemperate person, what the rest of us call excessive pleasure, the intemperate person just thinks is the right amount of pleasure. So the intemperate person, well, let's read what Aristotle says right after footnote 13. He, the intemperate person, seems to be better than someone who acts not because of rational calculation, but because of incontinence, right? Remember, the incontinent person has the correct rational calculation, but does not act on the basis of it, okay? So why is it that Aristotle thinks that the intemperate person is better than the incontinent person here? For the first person, that's the intemperate person, is the easier to cure because he might be persuaded to act otherwise, right? We have a chance to persuade the intemperate person that she's wrong in her intemperate pursuit of pleasure. But the incontinent person illustrates the proverb, if water chokes us, how are we to wash it down? Now, I'm not sure what Aristotle means by that, but let's keep reading. Maybe some of you have a better idea about it than I do. For if he had been persuaded to do the action he does, he would have stopped when he was persuaded to act otherwise. But in fact, though already persuaded to act otherwise, he still acts wrongly. So what this means is it won't help us to reason with the incontinent person because the incontinent person already has the right opinion about the excessive pursuit of pleasure. She thinks that it's bad, but her feeling gets the upper hand and she behaves in an excessive way in relation to pleasure anyway. Okay, so we have Aristotle in this passage saying that intemperance is better than incontinence. And again, the intemperate person is able to govern her actions through reason, right? So remember, for the intemperate person who believes that excessive pursuit of pleasure is the right thing, she is able to guide her life by her reason. Her reason and her behavior are in harmony with one another. That's not the problem. The problem is the intemperate person has the wrong opinion about excessive use of pleasure. So the good news is the opinion can change. So it looks like the intemperate person's condition of vice is curable, as you just have to convince this person that their opinion is wrong and their behavior will change because there's someone whose behavior is in accordance with their reason. And also, if we draw the consequence from that, it looks like on that line of reasoning that incontinence, bad news, is curable because you can't help them by convincing them that their opinion is wrong. Their opinion is already right. Right? So we have a problem with the incontinent person. We don't seem to have a solution to their situation. So does that mean that the incontinent person is hopeless? Well, not exactly, because in other passages, I haven't given you the quotations here, but in other passages, Aristotle thinks that there's a basis for hope in the case of incontinence. He even thinks that the incontinent person is better in some ways than the intemperate person. And the issue turns on regret, right? The incontinent person already holds the right opinion about excessive pleasure. The incontinent person has a conflict between what she thinks is right and how she behaves. And I added something here to the sentence, the incontinent person feels a conflict, right? She feels the conflict between her reason and her behavior. Now that feeling is called regret. And this is good news, right? Because if you want to help the incontinent person become continent, you can use their regret as a hook to motivate them to change. There's the hope in the case of the incontinent person. Well, what's the contrast with the intemperate person? The intemperate person feels no regret about their actions. And why would they? They have no conflict between their reason and their behavior. And they also have no awareness that what they're doing is wrong. So the bad news with the intemperate person is the intemperate person cannot be motivated to change by using their regret, by using the fact that they feel bad about their behavior. So what's the upshot here at this very complicated picture, and why is it that Aristotle is so concerned about this distinction? Here's the answer. Both incontinence and intemperance turn out to be curable, but because they are distinctively different states, incontinence and intemperance need different approaches. In order to cure the incontinent person, you tap into regret. If you want to help the intemperate person and move them in the direction of the virtue of temperance, you reason with them, you try to convince them that the pursuit of excessive pleasure is wrong, right? But regret won't work on the intemperate person because they have no felt conflict between reason and behavior. Reason and behavior are in line with one another. They're happy with the way that they're acting. So you have to change their opinion. And likewise, it won't help you to reason with the incontinent person because the incontinent person already holds the right opinion. To motivate the incontinent person, to change their behavior, you have to tap into the level of feeling where they feel regret and maybe feel even some disgust at their own behavior. And you can use that disgust to move them toward a better form of life. Now, one interesting question, Aristotle talks a little bit about drunkenness, right? And you might want to ask yourself, what's the relationship between what Aristotle says about intemperance and incontinence on the one hand, and something like alcoholism or addiction? My suspicion is that alcoholism and addiction come closer to Aristotle's vice of incontinence, right? Because frequently for the person who is an addict, you see the person feeling regret. You see this felt conflict between what they know to be right and their behavior, which they themselves judge to be wrong. So they turn out to be someone who's very unhappy with their own behavior. They have a sense that it's wrong. But maybe there are people who are addicted to various kinds of pleasure who really believe that their way of life is the right way, right? And so Aristotle's point is, when you have this disruption in character where someone has an excessive pursuit of pleasure, you want to observe very carefully, where is the dysfunction exactly? Is it that the person's reason is wrong, in which case you have intemperance and you can help the person by reasoning with them? Or is there a disconnect between the person's reason, their rational judgment, and their behavior, in which case you have to address that problem on a more felt level, on the level of emotional awareness and felt awareness. The nice thing about that is the fact that Aristotle does value this level of felt awareness means that he already knows some of what the ethics of care is really going to talk the most about, which is the role of feeling in moral life. So in the next video, we're going to get Aristotle's final word on the relationship between pleasure and the virtuous life, which of course is the same for him as the relationship between pleasure and happiness.